Oh hey there! If you watch the channel normally, you'll know that I like to start out each video with some completely random intro. Well, I'm going to be busy for the next couple weeks, so I decided to work on a lot of videos so I can automatically upload them. That way you don't have to go a while without an upload. And I accidentally spent 2 or 3 days working on an intro for the next video, and now I have no time to make an intro for this video. So yeah, let's just get started because there's no creative intro. Hey everyone, thanks for watching How to Pixel. And today's video is all about something called pixel port sharing. Pixel port sharing is all about how a controller divides up all of the pixels it can possibly run across all of the onboard ports, all of the expansion board ports, and all of the receiver chains attached to the controller. It's how the controller divides up all of the pixels across all of those ports. Now, for those of you who regularly watch the channel, you may be wondering, whoa, wait a minute. This video was supposed to be part 2 to the last video about differential receivers. Where's that? I want to know how to use my differential receivers. Well, I originally intended for all of this pixel port sharing talk to be in that part 2 video, but I realized that pixel port sharing is important for a lot of other things besides just differential receivers, and the script was already so long for the video, and I didn't want to cram everything else for differential receivers in this video. So that's why I'm making this separate video just for pixel port sharing, and don't worry, part 2 of the receivers video should hopefully be out after this video. But if you came here just to learn about pixel port sharing, have no idea what I'm talking about with receivers, have no idea who I am, never watched the channel before, don't worry, we're gonna get into pixel port sharing. Oh, and I'm Nick, by the way. Like always, please feel free to use the timestamps in the scrub bar and in the description below so you can skip to whatever part of the video you want to see. That way you're not wasting your time on other parts of the video that won't be useful for you. And yeah. Now I'm going to be talking about pixel port sharing mainly for Falcon controllers because I run those in my show, so I know a lot about them and I'm really used to them. So we're going to be talking about those types of controllers with pixel port sharing. However, other controllers may be similar to Falcon controllers, especially when I go on to talk about how pixel port sharing works when you have chains of receivers. So don't feel like you can't watch this video just because you don't have a Falcon controller. It can still apply for other types of controllers. But now, let's get started with the basics and what pixel port sharing is. So if you're brand new to a lot of this pixel controller stuff, you may have never heard of the term pixel port sharing before. Or if you have a little bit of experience, you might have heard people talking about it when adding expansion boards or receivers to their controller. Pixel port sharing, like I said, is how a controller splits up all of the pixels it can handle running across all the onboard ports, all of the expansion boards, and all of the receivers. You can sort of think of it as the controller splitting up all of its resources across the multiple different things that it has to take care of. Now, why do we need to know about pixel port sharing? And why does a controller need to split up its resources across all of the ports? Well, normally, if you have an F16 type controller, or maybe an F4 type controller, you don't have to worry about pixel port sharing, as long as you don't have any expansions or anything on them. That's because since there's not much attached to those controllers, just 16 ports or 4 ports depending on which one you have, the resources on the controller can handle running the normal amount of pixels or the default amount of pixels per port. And that's normally 1024 pixels per port, but it differs depending on which type of controller you have. But for all Falcon controllers, the max is normally 1024. But now if you're using an F48 type controller or an F16 type controller with expansion boards, now you're going to have to worry about pixel port sharing and how the controller divides up its resources among all of the ports on it. For the most part, some scenarios are a little different and I'll get to that later, but for the most part, when you add expansions to a controller or receiver chains to a controller, it's actually not increasing how many pixels the controller can run. What it's instead doing is taking all of the pixels that you could have ran on the main ports and splitting them up now with some of the other ports we have attached. That's why it's called pixel port sharing, because it's sharing the pixels over all of the ports. Pixel port sharing works a little differently depending on which type of controller you have. For example, all of the V3 Falcon controllers, as soon as you add any expansions to them, it immediately splits all of the pixels across those ports. However, with the V4 or V5 controllers, the hardware has gotten a little better, so you can add a few extra ports and gain more pixels by adding those ports, but it does come with a limit, and eventually if you add more and more ports, you're going to have to split them again. Now, why can't the controller just run the max of 1024 pixels across all of the ports even when you add more ports? Well, this is because you could technically have a controller like an F48 where you can chain 12 receiver chains to it, and if you have 6 receivers, which is the max on each chain, this controller has to control 288 ports. And if you were to put the max of 1024 pixels across all 288 ports, this controller would have to run just over 290,000 pixels. And that's a lot of numbers to talk about. So that's why when you add more and more ports to the controller, whether it be with local expansion board ports or differential receiver chains, that's why the controller has to take the max pixels it can control and share them across the ports. Because when you add more and more ports, the controller cannot handle running the max amount of pixels on all of those ports. Now you may be thinking, well, what's the point of adding more ports to the controller then, if in most situations it doesn't give me more pixels? That is a very valid question, but let me ask you this. When is the last time you've actually used all 1024 pixels off of one port? Sure, there may be a few rare cases where you've had to, maybe it's easier to chain the props that way, or maybe you just ran out of ports, so you had to add the props to the end of other props and increase the amount of pixels on the port. But then you run into a lot of problems, like crazy amounts of power injection you have to do on the whole strand, data loss if you have long wires between the props, and if you run your sequences at 40 frames per second, you usually can't even use the max. You have to use around 700 because the data can't get down the line fast enough. So let's say you have this F16 V3 controller that has 16 ports on it, and by default, without any expansions or anything connected to it, it can run 1024 pixels per port. If you expand the board and add another 16 ports to the controller, now instead of having 16 ports of 1024, you have 32 ports of 512. 512 is a much more practical limit because still a lot of people don't even need that many pixels per port. And if you do need that many pixels per port, well, now you have 32 ports, so you can just take the props that were maybe on an end of a strand and hook them to their own port. That helps with less power injection. If a pixel fails on a strand, all those props won't go out now because you're separating them on different ports. So having less pixels per port and a lot more ports can be handy for a lot of people. But then you might say, oh, but I don't want to have all these cables for each individual prop running back to the port. Sure, having more ports is nice, but that means more wires everywhere. Well, then instead of getting a local expansion board with local ports, you could get a differential expansion board that allows you to hook receivers up. And then you can put these receivers near the props and connect all the props directly into here. After that, you only need to run one Ethernet cable between this receiver and the differential expansion board. So most people will usually go that route because it's easier than having wires everywhere. Or if you have, let's say, a massive mega tree with lots of pixels, adding those local ports could be helpful if you put a controller right in the tree. 16 ports might not be enough if you have a huge tree. Well, now if you have 32 ports, all of the strands can connect to those ports and you don't need to hook strands together. So that's why lots of people like to expand their controllers with either local ports or differential receiver chains because it makes it easier to take full use of the controller. Those 1024 pixels on one port, it's hard to take use of that because you have to change so many things to use all of those pixels. But now if you have more ports, sure, you can use less pixels per port, but now you can access more of those pixels because you have more ports. So that's the basics on what pixel port sharing is. Now I'm going to talk about how the different Falcon controllers handle pixel port sharing and their limitations and all that involved. I'll be talking about the V3, V4, and V5 controllers. Now, quick disclaimer before I get started. Whenever I'm talking about receiver chains, I'm not going to have multiple to start. I'm just going to use one to make it simple. And then towards the end of the video, I'll talk about how pixel port sharing works when you have a whole chain of receivers, because you also have to split the pixels across these when there's a chain. But now let's get started and talk about how V3 series controllers handle pixel port sharing. So first we have the F16 V3. On the F16 V3 there are 16 pixel ports, and each port can run 1024 pixels. The entire controller can control 16,384 pixels. So if you do the math, the 1024 divides into it perfectly for 16 ports. Now if you wanted to expand the board, you could attach a ribbon cable like this into this little slot right here, and this is where you connect all of your expansion boards. There are two different types of expansion boards. One adds another 16 local ports to the controller. I don't have that one. But the other one is the differential expansion board that looks like this. And if you were to attach a receiver to each one of these outputs, you would notice you still get 16 extra ports, because each of these have 4 ports on them, and if you connect 4 times 4 is 16. You can connect up to 2 expansions to the controller, so you could use 2 differential expansions, 2 local port expansions, or one of each. By adding one of either of these expansion boards, the controller now has to share that 16,384 pixels across 32 ports. Now with the V3 series controller, they actually give you this little slider on the web interface that you can use to set the maximum amount of pixels per port for each section of the controller. You can make it so the onboard pixel ports can have more pixels per port than the receiver board, or vice versa. If you put it right in the middle to make it equal, all the ports on both the controller and the receiver can have 512 pixels per port. Now if you were to attach a second expansion board, this would bring the controller to having a total of 48 ports. They might be local ports if you're using local expansions, or they could be used on the receivers if you have receivers attached to the expansion boards. But now with 2 expansion boards, you have to split these 16,384 pixels across 48 ports. So if you look at the little slider again, now you'll see that there are 2 little things you can move to divide the pixels across all 3 sections. If you wanted to make it equal, you'd set it to about 341. One section would get 342 pixels, but that's to make it equal. Or if you wanted to, you could let the onboard ports get 600 pixels per port, the first expansion to get 300 pixels per port, and then the final one would get 124 pixels per port. So you could customize that how you want. The F48 V3 or F48 original is extremely similar to how the F16 V3 works with pixel port sharing. The F48 V3 can also run a max of 16,384 pixels, but there are no onboard ports. You have to use receivers. If you were to attach a receiver to each of the 12 receiver outputs, you would get 48 ports, and that's where the name F48 comes from. Since there are 48 ports on that entire controller, you have to split up that 16,384 pixels across all of those 48 ports. They're just not local ports. They could be all over your display because you're using Ethernet cables to attach differential receivers to them. The F48 is split up into 3 sections, and each section has 4 receiver outputs, which would mean 16 ports per section. So this is very similar to a fully expanded F16 V3, because the first section could be the 16 ports on an F16 V3, the second section could be like a expansion board connected to the F16 V3, and the final section could be like another expansion board connected to the F16 V3. So when you go on the web interface of the F48, you have to use that slider again to adjust how many pixels per port the different sections get. So I could set the top section to use 500 pixels per port, the middle section to have up to 100 pixels per port, and then the final section could be set to use 424 pixels per port. Now, if you weren't using a section of ports, maybe you only have 8 receiver chains or 4 receiver chains, you could set the other sections to use 0 pixels. That way you can move all of those pixels to the other ports that you are trying to use. And that's how pixel port sharing works on the F16 V3 and F48 V3. Now I'm going to talk about the F16 V4 and pixel port sharing on there. So the F16 V4 and all other V4 and V5 controllers actually got a little upgrade to them, and they can now control double the amount of pixels as the V3 series. They can control 32,768 pixels on all V4 and V5 controllers. However, the onboard ports are still limited to 1024 pixels just because the data is not fast enough to be able to have more pixels on one port. But, yes, there is a but because of this, if you add one expansion board, whether it be for 16 local ports or for 4 receivers, which would give you 16 ports, you can still run 1024 pixels on that expansion board and it won't split the other ones. Since the controller can run 32,768 pixels, it can run up to 32 ports with 1024 pixels. So the first expansion board is almost like a free trial. You don't have to pay by splitting pixels to use it. By adding an expansion board, you are increasing the amount of pixels the controller can run, since you couldn't access them all from the onboard ports. Now, if you do add a second expansion board, you will have to pay by splitting up pixels to use that, because the controller already reached the maximum amount of pixels it could use when you added the first one. So when you do add this second expansion board, you're going to have to split up the pixels across the 48 ports you will now have. Now with the F16 V4, they actually got rid of the little slider just to make it easier and one less thing to set up, and they automatically split all of the ports for you to use 704 pixels per port. So when there's 32 ports, all of them can use 1024 pixels. When there's 48 ports, all of them can use 704 pixels across the 48 ports, because 48 times 704 is 32,768. Wait a minute. The math says that 704 times 48 ports is 33,792 pixels. But I thought the limit was 32,768. Okay, that's a lot of numbers, but I did actually have to do some researching in the manual because it says that you can use 704 pixels across 48 ports, but that would be over the 32,000 port limit. So after reading through the manual, what I assume this means is you can use 704 pixels on any ports, and you can use them on most of the ports, but you can't use them over all the ports because that will go over the limit. So just remember to stay under the 32,768 pixel limit, but you can use 704 pixels per port. Now moving on to the F48 V4, I'm also going to talk about the F48 V5 at the same time because the way their pixel port sharing works is the exact same. So both these controllers, like the F16 V4, can run 32,768 pixels across the entire board. These F48s are also just like the F48 original, where there are 12 receiver outputs and there are 3 groups of 4 outputs. However, these ones are a little bit different from the original because there are now 4 onboard pixel ports, but I'll get to those in a minute. So these two controllers have 2 different modes that you can run them in. You can run them in 32 port mode and 48 port mode. If you remember from the F16 V4 that I just talked about, 32 port mode would be like having a main controller and the one expansion. And if we remember, on these controllers, you can have one expansion without splitting up the pixels. Now, if you run it in 48 port mode, that's like having 2 expansions, so you will have to split up how many pixels per port you can use. So if you set the controller to 32 port mode, it will disable the 4 middle receiver outputs, and you can use any of the 8 remaining ones. And any receiver that you attach to these can use 1024 pixels per port, as long as you don't have multiple receivers on a chain, which we'll get to later in the video. So all 8 receivers could have 1024 pixels. Now if you turn on 48 port mode, all 12 outputs will be enabled and you can use a receiver on each of them, but now the receivers are going to be limited again to the 704 pixels per port. And just remember that you can't use 704 pixels across all of the ports because that would go over the 32,768 limit. So The first priority is to make sure to stay under 32,768 pixels total, and then the second priority is to make sure to stay under 704 pixels on each port if it's in 48 port mode. Now, if you want to take advantage of the 4 onboard pixel ports, these are directly connected to the last receiver output. These 4 ports are basically acting as a receiver built into the board that's connected to the final output. So if you don't need to use them, you can attach a receiver to the final output and go on your day, whatever. Now, if you do want to use these ports, you would set it up as if a receiver was connected to the final output, and these 4 ports are the receiver. So we're just pretending there's a receiver there, when actually it's just the 4 ports on the board. Now, you still can have a receiver chain on this output and use the onboard ports at the same time, because this pretend receiver here is acting as receiver A in the chain. So you could attach receivers to that output, and if you were to set one to A, it would replicate and do exactly what the pixel ports are doing on the board. But if you set them to B and then go C, D, E, and continue on if you have more, it would act like this is the first receiver in a chain, then this is the second, third, so on. So that is an option you can do, but just remember, when you have more receivers on one chain, the pixel count is lowered even more per port since you're sharing them across more ports. But like I said, I'll talk about that later in the video. And this is also the same for the F48V5. These 4 ports are just acting as if they were a pretend receiver connected to the last output. And then finally, we have the F16V5, which is arguably the most easy to deal with in terms of pixel port sharing. This is because there is no spot to plug in expansion boards on this. You cannot have any expansion boards because there's already a differential expansion board built in at the top. You have 4 receiver outputs here at the top that act as a differential expansion. And this is the only expansion this board has, meaning you can only run this in 16 port mode or 32 port mode, whereas the other ones also had the 48 port mode. But this is actually very helpful in terms of simplicity, and let me tell you why. So this controller, just like the other V4 and V5 controllers, can run 32,678 pixels on the board. There are 16 onboard ports, but like always, those can only run 1,024 pixels. So without attaching any receivers, the board can only run 16,384 pixels. Now, if you were to attach a receiver to each receiver output that acts like the differential expansion connected to the board, those would give you another 16 ports, and the other 16,384 pixels you could run on those ports. Meaning you can have all of these ports and a receiver attached to each output and still run 1,024 pixels on all of these ports. So there actually is no pixel port sharing on this controller. The only time you do that is if you have multiple receivers on a chain. But that is all the Falcon controllers I'm going to talk about with pixel port sharing. Like I said, if you have a different brand controller, they probably have some sort of pixel port sharing too. It just might not be the exact same numbers or sizes the Falcon controllers use. But now I'm going to talk about pixel port sharing when you're using lots of receivers on one chain. And this will probably apply to you no matter which controller you have if you're using receivers, because the Falcon controller receivers work the same on other controllers that support them. In all of the examples I was showing with the other controllers just a minute ago, I only had one single receiver on the chains. So when I was saying that you could only use 512 pixels on the ports, or 704, or 1024, you could only use that many pixels per port on here. But what happens when you have multiple receivers connected to one chain, or an SRX2 receiver, which counts as 2 receivers, or an SRX4 receiver, which counts as 4? Does that affect all of the other ports on the controller? Does it suck up some of those pixels and have to make you share them more? Or does it allow you to gain more pixels? Or what happens? So what happens is if you have more than one receiver, the pixels that are being sent to this receiver now have to be split with the rest on the chain. So it doesn't affect any other outputs, it just affects the receivers in this chain. And let me show you a little example to make it all come together. If I had a single receiver attached here on this F48, the receiver would use ports 13 to 16, because if you look at the label, this receiver output runs ports 13 to 16. out of the 48 ports? Well, if I add another receiver to this chain, the ports on the first receiver now become port 13A, 14A, 15A, and 16A. Then the 4 ports on the second receiver become 13B, 14B, 15B, and 16B. If I add another receiver, it would be 13C, 14C, so on. And you could do this with up to 6 receivers. So on the final receiver, if you had 6, it would be 13F, 14F, 15F, and 16F. So let's say, just to make it simple, you're running this controller in 32 port mode. That means you can use 1024 pixels per port. This means that if you had a single receiver on a chain, ports 13, 14, 15, and 16 could run 1024 pixels. Well, now what happens that we have multiple receivers on this chain is this 1024 pixels that each port gets has to be split up with all the other ports of the same number. So 13A, 13B, and 13C must share 1024 pixels. Same with 14A, B, and C, they must share 1024. 15A, B, and C, and 16A, B, and C must also share 1024 pixels. So if you were trying to split this up evenly, each port could run about 341 pixels since we're now splitting it across 3 ports. If we had the max of 6 receivers on a chain, the 1024 pixels would have to be shared across 6 ports, which would be this many pixels per port. Now, if you were to have something like this on a V3 series controller, the controller forces you to split them evenly. So it will set a max for 341 pixels for each individual port. That way it's being split evenly. However, with the V4 and V5 controllers, they did a little reprogramming to them. So the controllers don't care at all how many pixels you have per port, as long as all the ports together in that section do not go over the limit, which is 1024 pixels right now. So I could have 700 pixels on port 13A, 200 on 13B, then 100 on 13C. And combined, that's only 1000 pixels, so the controller's happy. It doesn't care, because you're not going over the limit. Then on 14A, B, and C, I could do something different, like maybe have 300 pixels on 14A, 500 on 14B, and then 50 on 14C. That still is under 1024, so the Pixel controller does not care. And then heck, even if you wanted to, you could run 1024 pixels on 15A, but then nothing on 15B or 15C, and the controller would still be happy because you're not going over the limit. The most important thing though is that you just need to remember what the limit is per port. Right now the limit's 1024 because we're running the controller in 32 port mode. But if we turn it to 48 port mode and activate those middle receiver outputs, each port only gets 704 pixels now, meaning that 13A, B, and C must share the new limit 704. Same with 14A, B, and C, 15A, B, and C, and 16A, B, and C. And then if you have an SRX2 or an SRX4 receiver, just remember these count as 2 and 4 receivers. So with an SRX4, you would have 13, 14, 15, and 16A right here. Then these ones would be 13, 14, 15, 16B, 13, 14, 15, 16C, and 13, 14, 15, 16D. And you can see that these are 4 different receiver blocks because the board outlines them for you just to make it simpler. And then if we were going to run some pixels on it, all of the 13 ports need to share 704 pixels since we're still in 48 port mode. So 13A, 13B, 13C, and 13D need to share 704. And if you added another receiver or 2 more at the end, you would also need to share the 704 with the 13 ports on there. Now everything I just talked about with how the pixels are split up on receiver chains applies no matter where you're using the receiver chain. Whether it's on an F48 type controller, an F16 V5 on the receiver outputs, an F48 V4 with a differential expansion, or even if you're using the 2 receiver outputs on the F48 V4, the way the pixels are split up still is the same. You just need to remember what the limit is depending on what you're connecting this to. This actually also applies to V3 series controllers. You just need to remember that they're strict. They don't let you do it however you want. they're automatically going to split it up evenly across all the ports. And you can only have up to 3 receivers per chain on V3 controllers. And I think that's going to conclude it for everything about pixel port sharing. Just for a quick little recap, remember that pixel port sharing has to be done twice basically if you are using receiver chains. First, it gets split up depending on if the controller is in 32 port mode or 48 port mode. That dictates how many pixels you can use on each of the ports before you chain receivers. And then if you do add chains of receivers, that shared amount of pixels must be shared again across the entire receiver chain. Now that was a lot of information in this video and a lot of numbers and different things. So if you're confused, I completely understand. And if you have any questions or comments or think I didn't explain something well, maybe have some tips for me, please feel free to leave any of those things I just listed in the comment section down below. And I will try to respond as soon as I can to help out or listen to whatever advice you have. But that's going to conclude everything for this tutorial. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.